We're going to start together. We don't spend actually spend a ton of time together for nearly 35 years, but most of the time it'll just be one of us up, but we wanted to introduce ourselves. And as I do that, before I say a little bit about myself and how we came to be doing this, I just want to kind of put a marker down here, and because I really appreciated both the opening with Andy and referencing the Apostle Paul, and in particular that kind of wonderful response that what? Regarding the fact that financial leadership is an aspect of your calling, of your spiritual leadership. And by way of introduction, I wanted to say that we, of course, when we think about Paul, the apostle, how did Paul raise his money? Because again, that whole thing about you are my recommendations, there's a money component behind that, because of course an itinerant preacher-teacher like Paul, he's an itinerant like we are, preacher-teacher like Paul would carry letters of recommendation saying, I'm somebody worth listening to. Here's my bona fides. Here's some people saying that. And what Paul's saying, I don't have those. I'm not a professional rhetorician. I'm not an itinerant preacher-speaker like they would have had in the Greco-Roman world. Therefore, you are my letters of reference. The reality that Christ has been active in your lives and you are being transformed, you have become my recommendations to keep doing the work that Christ has called me to do. So he's saying, I have foregone that whole financial aspect in order to put my focus there. There's one other thing I want you to think about with Paul, and this kind of gets to what I'm hoping, I'm positive it's already begun. You would not be here if that had not already begun. But that will continue today and throughout this time, and then on and on beyond your time in this school. And that's this, that you will begin to undergo a transformation of your imaginations, that you really will have a difference in perspective as a result of being a participant in this. And let me just give you one example of that need for a change in perspective. Again, when we think about Paul, how did Paul raise money for himself? This is not a trick question. Made tents, exactly. He made tents. And of course, so we think about the apostle, and again, when we talk about tent maker ministry, we always tend to think about doing something necessary in order to be doing the main thing that you want to be doing, right? Okay. So, of course, that being the case, we think of Paul, of course, as the apostle. That's how he presents himself. That's what he was. Paul the apostle, who had to make tents in order to fulfill his vocation. That certainly is one way to look at it. But there's also another way to look at it, and that's this. The businessman Paul, who really did live the life of a businessman, a merchant, so Paul's already a much higher status than the vast majority of folks that he's bumping into, a business person who also now has been called to preach the good news of Jesus Christ. Can you start to see a little bit of a difference? How does it look then? How if you start reading the New Testament as, this is a business person who's talking to me. This is a person who intricately knew, and then because of those business relations, had access to Priscilla and Aquila and the remarkable things that God was doing. So start to undergo that transformation of perspective. Now again, I'm not trying to rewrite history or really think entirely differently, because obviously Paul presents himself. His identity, like all of our identities, is he is a new creation in Jesus Christ. He's the person called out of time to be an apostle of Christ. But he's a business person, has been doing that, and he does not shed that identity, all the gifts and all the abilities that he had in that way, because he didn't have to put those things aside. It had been foolish for him. Those things enabled and opened the doors necessary for him to be doing the things he wanted to do. So that's just kind of one way to start thinking about what we're talking about, not only today, but in this school as a whole. How do we allow God to transform our way of thinking? How do we become open up to this and I'll talk more about this morning, this very obscure idea that talking about money in the church is not something that we have to hold our nose and do. It's not something that we're, oh, God help me. It's the fall of the year. We got to talk about money because we got to do a budget again. How do we get that idea transformed to what I would say the reality is. Every person who comes into this church, every person with whom I'm in contact in one way or other, struggles with their relationship to money. Folks who don't have money struggle with their relationship to money. You know what? Folks who got more money than what they know to do with struggle with their relationship to money. How then, that being the case, and knowing for us as United Methodists, we do believe that there's not a person born in this life who's not touched by the grace of Jesus Christ, the prevenience of God's grace, how then do we begin to see the folks that God has called us to be with as an important part of what we're doing is trying to explore with them and help them think about money, how they're earning it, how they're saving it, and how they're giving it. All right? Okay. Well, I'm Philip Jamieson. You probably already figured that out of the two of us. And I am an elder. Up until actually this summer, I was a member of the East Ohio Annual Conference. And probably, yet to be unfold, the Bishop of Tennessee invited me to transfer to the Tennessee Annual Conference. I think it's a trap. But that time will tell as we go there. So now I'm a member of the Tennessee Annual Conference. I served churches in the Cleveland, Ohio area for about 11 years. And then after that, we moved to Dubuque, Iowa, where I taught in a Presbyterian seminary, which, like many seminaries, about 40% of the student body was United Methodist. So I taught there. And now, although Jack has no equivalent, I'm the closest thing that passes for one in the Tennessee and Memphis annual conferences. I'm the president of the foundation for those two annual conferences. So that's what I'm doing now. So let me tell you, okay, so pastor, seminary professor, foundation president. What? How do you get from those to that? I'm glad you asked. About 15 years ago now, the dean of the seminary where I was teaching came up to me. Oh, also, Janet will say more about herself, but Janet taught accounting on the undergraduate school. This is the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. Small seminary, about 150 students, but then a part of a larger, about 2,000 student undergraduate program. Janet taught accounting in the undergraduate program. My dean came to me and said, the Presbyterian Church has given us some money to do something in stewardship. How about you and Janet co-teach a class in the seminary on stewardship and, kind of just, money matters, financial things in the church? And the dean being my boss, I said, what a wonderful idea. I'd be delighted. So that, and I know he was just using me to get to have Janet to teach the seminary students. So what that then set me out on this process of trying to do some thinking about money in the church, because I want you to know something. If you are anything like me, I did as little as humanly possible on the money aspects of ministry when I was a pastor. I did. I was blessed to be a pastor in the 90s, and the economy was pretty good where we were, which meant two very important things. And basically, as far as I was concerned, the only things that actually counted as far as money in the church, we paid our apportionments, and I got raises. If it ain't broke, why try to fix it? Now, there's a little bit more to that. I would ask for additional money. Whenever there was a need, a missional need, the folks were generous, and they supported it. So like I said, if it ain't broke, why try to fix it? Because there was never a person said, preacher, I've been in Tennessee now, so we talk about being preachers. Pastor, nobody ever came and said, what we need is you to preach a lot on money. What we need in this church is for you to go out of your way that every opportunity you get, you're talking to me about money. That never happened. And being a good American, like I assume pretty much everyone is in this room, we don't talk about money out in the open. It's nobody's business, right? Okay. So, if it ain't broke, why try to fix it? Preparing the first time for the lectures, for this little class that Jan and I would teach together, something strange happened. Something happened that never happened before or ever happened since when I was doing prep work for teaching a class for the first time. I'll use another old term. I fell under conviction. And the conviction was this: had I spoken more about money, it wasn't so much that we could have raised a lot more money in the church. What the conviction was this: how many opportunities did I miss to really engage people where they lived and where they rejoiced and where their hearts were being broken? It really hit me. I mean, it hit me like a ton of bricks. So you can say that, we do this teaching and do this consulting and all these sorts of things, but I guess again, change of the imagination. Maybe I'm kind of an evangelist to help pastors really embrace, in their own way, in their own context, what I've come to realize is essential. Not just so that we can make churches function better, not just so that we can ensure a future, which is all very important goals, but that you and I can fulfill our vocations in caring and loving the people God has sent us to be with. So I'm hoping that you'll see that, again, not just in our part today, but throughout your time in this school and going forward, how does God want to talk to you? How does God want to talk to me about how I really can be more faithful in fulfilling the work that God has given us, has shared with us in this vital and crucial area that, frankly, well, let's see a show of hands. How many, and again, it's possible from time to time we do encounter this, but how many of you in your theological education had a class that was strictly on the money aspects of ministry? Okay, so some. What school?
Wesley.
At Wesley, right. Wesley's doing that now. With Wesley? Another school?
Drew
At Drew, okay.
It was an elective.
An elective, yeah, an elective course.
St. Mary's Seminary, University of Baltimore.
Okay, all right, okay.
Palmer Seminary, Eastern College.
Oh, wow. I'm going to have to stop asking this question because, that's your... Anyway, ignore these people. What my real point is that none of you... Well, I think it's still safe to say, but it actually has been changing. But when we wrote the book that you have, I did some research, and there was no seminary that required it. And you remember your theological education, the required courses, there's a difference between electives and required courses. And it's obviously the required courses, what is it? Well, they're required, you have to take them, because a judgment has been made that this is essential for your ministry. Electives are, well, they can round you out some, and they can be helpful, and maybe if you want to go deeper in an area, those are good things. And of course, sometimes our electives are far better, or oftentimes electives are far better than the essential courses anyway. But they're elective. Take it or leave it. You don't really need this, because if you really needed it, it would be required of you. Okay. So, the message was sent clearly to us in our training to do the work that we felt Christ was calling us to do, that, you may bump into some things from here and now, but it'll be fine. And so we were set up, many of us. Now, some of you maybe had a background in business, so you already knew how the world worked, and you knew that the church was maybe not of the world, but certainly in the world, and therefore money would have something to do with things.
Tell them about your first ad council.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, I will. First ad, I had, my father said I tried to avoid working as long as humanly possible. So after seminary, I went to graduate school in order to forget everything I'd learned in seminary. And I did a PhD in theology where I studied Latin texts, medieval Christology. Maybe this afternoon, if things are winding down, we can talk about that some. No, rest assured. So anyway, I, been to seminary, then spent 4 years getting my mind filled with all kinds of things that didn't have a whole lot to do with the practical aspects of ministry. Finally take my first appointment, sitting in my first ad council meeting, this man called the treasurer is handing out papers. Now again, I'd been reading Latin paleography, it's called. It's Latin shorthand to read manuscripts. So it wasn't even just Latin, and of course we don't have that in high school anymore, but it wasn't even Latin that, printed. This was handwritten stuff, so it was wild. I knew how to read. I knew how to read crazy things. But this man's passing out paper, and there's no Latin on it, And there's little English on it. What's on it are a lot of numbers. And to make things even more curious, some of the numbers had parentheses around them. Now, I was educated well enough to know this much. There are some questions you don't ask, assuming that they may well be a stupid question. So my question was, I wonder what these numbers mean when they have parentheses around them. I'd almost finished my PhD. So I went home and I asked the resident CPA, and when she got done laughing, my education continued. So if some of you are sitting thinking, what do the numbers with parentheses around them? Somebody can gently take you aside. Maybe Janet can gently take you aside. She won't laugh at you like she did me. All right, so that's why we're here. One thing led to another. We taught this class. It was well received. We wrote a book that led to requests to speak like this, which opened up the possibility of a change in career, working with a foundation, and here we are. Now Janet's going to introduce herself, and pay attention. She's a wonderful teacher.
I think I'm.
Oh, you got it. Okay.
Well, not unlike Phil, my path has been a long one to get where I am and to get to the point where I stand before you today. I grew up in a parsonage, so I've had dealings with clergy my entire life. I guess I've been sleeping under the same roof as a clergy person my whole life, because my father was in ministry for his whole life, and then married Phil. So that was an interesting start to life. I, some point in time, became a CPA and worked in public accounting for a number of years and did quite a bit with clergy income tax because I had to. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. I mean, I had to learn it. It's true. And I'll share that with you this afternoon. So that's part of what brings me to this spot. Most recently, where I'm working right now is with the Episcopalians. After teaching out in Iowa for all those years, I taught for a year in Nashville and then took a job as the Chief Financial Officer for the Episcopal Diocese of Tennessee. So that's been an interesting experience, and trying to, again, work with clergy, priests. So if I call you a priest today, it's because I got my Episcopalian hat on. That's going to be coming to an end real quickly, though, because November 7th, I'm going to be starting a position as the Chief Financial Officer for the Board of Discipleship Ministries in Nashville. So I'm coming home. Coming home. Well, we do want to get started a little bit this morning with the slides that are up here. And I'm a layperson, obviously. I always like to start with a story, though, that it comes out of my background. And I know that one of the things that you're going to be doing, one of your assignments, is to start to think theologically about money and kind of articulate a theology of money. And part of what we've done with students through the years in the seminary level was ask them to do what's called a money autobiography. So not unlike what the assignments you'll be doing, which is to kind of reflect personally in your own life. How have you related to money? And that's a good question. It might be something worth reflection. It might be something worth incorporating into the work that you're going to be doing here. To try to think about, what was the role of money in the house where I grew up? What was money like? Did it cause tension? Was it a cause of comfort? How did we relate to money? Well, I did that at one point in time in teaching this class with Phil out at the seminary. Started to think about a money autobiography and try to think autobiographically about money. And it's amazing the things you start to piece together when you have the perspective of years and you look back. Well, I've already told you that I grew up in a parsonage. My father was a Christian and Missionary Alliance pastor, small denomination, but relatively, there were some relatively good-sized churches in Pennsylvania and Ohio. So I grew up in the Akron, Ohio area. I'm cheering for the Cleveland Indians, by the way. But grew up in a parsonage, and as I think back about money in my household growing up, there was always appeared to be, enough of money. There always seemed to be enough money to take small vacations. We didn't take anything extravagant, but my dad loved the national parks, so he'd load us in the car and we'd go to a national park in the summer. We seemed to have money to eat out. I seemed to dress as nicely as the other little girls that got on the school bus or walked to the little local elementary school. We had visitors. We had a lot of company. It was a denomination that had a lot of missionaries, so it seemed like there was always a missionary staying at our house, and my mother was always cooking dinner on Sundays for the missionaries or for whoever else was coming through. I felt very comfortable as a child growing up. Well, I went off to college, picked up a husband along the line back there in the back, faced the conclusion that he was going to go into ministry. Someplace along the line, I became a CPA and decided I've got to embrace this clergy income tax thing because I'm going to be dealing with this for the rest of my life. So I started to learn as I had to, because there was not a whole lot of demand for that in public accounting, because most public accounting firms don't get a whole lot of clergy that come in to get taxes done. But anyway, so I decided to learn personally so I could do Phil's return. Well, it occurred to me I could do this for my father and mom, my mom and dad. So I call up my dad. Dad, feeling kind of proud. I just passed the CPA exam. I can do your tax return for you. He said, great. He'd always done it himself. So he bundles up the stuff, sends it to me. I get the envelope. I sit down to do his income tax return. And I will never forget two things. As I leafed through that information that he provided, they provided. The first was his earnings statement, probably a 1099 in those days, looking at that and thinking, oh my goodness, I can't believe how little he makes. You know, I was just starting in public accounting, but I mean, he was making, I'm sure he had a housing allowance at that point, I think, but it just wasn't much. So I was just kind of shocked by that. And then continuing to go through the information and adding it up on my little 10-key calculator, how much they gave away. It was just shocking to me how little they made and how much they gave away. And as I've reflected years later back on this, I've thought to myself, there really wasn't any money growing up as a kid. There never was any money. I just thought there was money. I just felt like there was money. And it took me all the way until 10 years ago, probably, to put this together, that I grew up in a household of abundance.
Yep.
A household of gratitude. There really never was much money. I just always felt that there was. I've asked my sister and my brother this question, and they felt the same way. That, you know, you get right down to it, there wasn't much money. My father passed away before my mother did. They're both gone now. And my sister and I were there cleaning out. I think my brother was in the next room or whatever, but we were going through some of my dad's papers. And my mom at this point is in her 90s, so fairly feeble. And I came on this document that it was a letter that my father had written in about 1960 to his parents, explaining to them that they felt, my mother and he felt that God was asking them to give away, and he lists the amount of money, to the church for missions, because they would have these mission conferences every year, and their hearts were so convicted, to use that word that Phil used earlier, that they felt they needed to give away, and he listed the amount of money. And I sat there and I thought, okay, 1960, I'm trying to go back in time. How much would, and I thought to myself, my goodness, that's a lot of money, because I know he didn't make that much, and I know what he was making by the time I started preparing his tax returns. So I went across the room with a letter to my mother, who's sitting in a chair, fairly feeble, but still very, very sound mind. And I showed it to her. I said, do you remember this letter? And she said, yeah, sort of. And I said, I pointed to the amount. I said, was this like 20% of your income? She looks up at me, she said, I think it was more like a third. So 1960, I mean, how did I even have enough to eat? I can't imagine. They were giving away a third of their income. So a household of abundance, a household of gratitude, something I think which is probably not the case for most American Christians. And we want to start moving into our slides here. This book we would recommend to you. Passing the Plate. The two authors, Christian Smith and Michael Emerson, are both sociologists of religion. The title down below, Why American Christians Don't Give Away More Money. And they identify in this book a ton of wonderful things. It's really readable for a book that is heavy on statistics, and a lot of the statistical stuff in the middle of the book, you can go through pretty quickly. But the conclusions they reach in the early chapters and then towards the end of the book are really, really very valuable. Anyway, they identify some alarming statistics that I think are really helpful as we frame this question of the problem of money in the church. First of all, 20% of self-identified Christians in the United States report giving away nothing. Nothing. 20%. And this, they self-identify because they mark this on their little questionnaire that they give nothing. And obviously giving would be a positive characteristic, and people tend to over-report positive characteristics, so chances are it's even higher. 20% report giving away nothing, and this is not just nothing to their church. This is nothing at all. Nothing to anyone. They also corroborate this, in this book. They've done their own research, but they also pull in any other research that's helpful. And this statistic is corroborated by another one that looked at it by denomination. Want to know how bad it is in the United Methodist Church? Another study said 30% for Methodists report giving nothing. Okay, another statistic they report in this book. 1/2, I think it's actually closer to 60%, of all the contributions to the church are given by just 5% of the members. You know that already, don't you? You know that. You're sitting there and you're saying, I know that statistic because it's true in my church. So 60%, nearly 60% of all contributions to the church come from just 5% of the members. So we have a group of very, very generous people that are covering for the rest of the folks in the pews who are giving little or nothing. I think Phil said he saw a statistic recently, 85% given by 15%. So that's a more recent statistic. It's basically the same type of thing. They go on in this book and they make the observation that if committed Christians, those who call themselves Christians, people that attend regularly, profess to be Christian, if committed Christians tithed, and if just a third of those who are less committed, in other words, they don't maybe go quite as much to church, if those folks gave a half a tithe, what could we generate for mission and ministry in this world? And they come up with the statistic of $133 billion in addition to what is already given. $133 billion extra if those who come every Sunday would tithe, and those who come maybe once a month, even just a portion of them would give a half a tithe. We could come up with $133 billion more. And then in this book, in one of the chapters in the book, they just go on and on and on and on of page after page after page after page of the things that you would have to do collectively, all the things you could do to spend $133 billion in the course of a year. And it's just fun to read because you just think, talk about something that will expand your imagination. So things like 100,000 new missionaries or pastors, 5 million economic development projects, 10,000 Christian literacy workers. You could quadruple the World Vision budget. You could quadruple, on and on and on. So you get the idea. So they ask the question, why don't American Christians give more? We are the wealthiest Christians in 2,000 years of church history, without a doubt. So why is it that we don't give? And they come up with a number of reasons. They call it the riddle of stingy Christian giving. That's the title of the chapter where they go after the why. The riddle of stingy Christian giving. Why don't American Christians give? And they come up with a number of reasons. We've picked 4 because they fit very nicely into what we like to focus on in our time with you. First of all, we value individualism. This has to do with the attitude. Money is mine. I worked hard for it. I'm not paid enough as it is for what I do. I'm not going to give it away to anybody. This is some exact quotes, because in addition to clicking stuff on a survey. They also got, quotes from folks. The church has no business in my pockets. It's not my church's business what I do with my money. It's between the individual and God if they don't give. So the idea that money is mine. Number 2, no money left after committing to 2 major consumer choices, housing and transportation being 2 of the biggest. So this isn't so much attitude, this is reality, right? The reality of it is that we overspend, we overconsume. They do go on in their analysis of this to say, is it true that we've actually overconsumed and have no money to give, or could it be that it's an image of scarcity? That we don't think we have enough. It's going to run out. We don't have enough. We can't do this because we've already spent so much, and we feel, as American consumers, we feel consumer driven. We have a scarcity mindset, and that's fueled by every ad you see on television, right? We're programmed to be consumers, therefore we don't think we have enough money. It's going to run out. There isn't enough to give. The third idea, or the third reason, suspicious. Suspicious of waste and abuse in the organizations to whom we might contribute, lack of trust. You will talk about that in a session down the line. In one of the sessions to come, you will talk about internal controls in the church and how critical those are. As an accountant, and I look at this list, that's the easy one to fix. That's the easy one to fix, because you can come in with controls that will greatly enhance the level of trust that your congregation has.
Jen, tell how much fraud there is. Do you have the statistic in mind of fraud?
I off the top of my head, know what I will tell you about fraud globally from churches. More is embezzled from churches and religious organizations worldwide than is given to missions.
Worldwide's the operative.
Worldwide is operative, exactly. And then 2, there's the assumption that in the people that crunch these numbers and look at these statistics, that the vast majority of it is not reported. Yeah, a lot of it is though. All you got to do is Google. I do this periodically just for fun. This is what you do when you're an accountant. I Google church fraud or church treasurer embezzles or pastor embezzles, or there's just keywords you can put in and you just get one right after another. And typically Google's smart enough to know where you're located, so it's going to give you the ones that are close to home first, which is really frightening because it's the church down the road or a few communities away, and you may or may not have seen it in the paper. But so those are the ones that are reported. Lots of them aren't. Easy one to fix though, and you're going to be given tools to try to help encourage that transparency in your congregations. That'll come in a later session. Finally, and we think most importantly, as far as framing the discussion that we are going to have today, money is a private matter. It's not discussed openly in church. It's not discussed anywhere, as Phil said. In polite company, we don't talk about money, and we don't talk about it in the church. Here's a quote from Emerson and Smith, the 2 authors of this book. In our culture, they say, money is one of the most personal, private, protected subjects going. That's true, isn't it? Most of us guard financial information about our financial condition and our behavior behind strong walls of intense secrecy. Is that not true? Intense secrecy. Info about one's own money is strictly a private matter, no one else's business, write the authors. It might not go too far to suggest that in our culture, money is sacred. Wow. Phil's going to come back to that point in a little bit. I have to tell you a funny story. Okay, so I was doing this presentation, did that little quote from Emerson and Smith at a gathering of Lutheran pastors in Florida. So I had this Lutheran pastor come up to me at the break, and he said, "Yeah, that money is sacred stuff. Yeah, I get that. I so respond to that." He said, "I just had an opportunity. I was in Chicago, and I had an opportunity to go out to Willow Creek, and Bill Hybels was preaching, and he said it was a great service. And he said, but he preached about money, and he said at one point in time in the sermon, he said, 'All right, ladies are men, whatever, get your purse out, get your wallet out of your purse, get your wallet out of your back pocket. And I want you to hold that wallet in front of you. And he said, I want you to look at that, and I want you to realize, and think about this, that that is your God. And then he said, he told us, now I want you to give that wallet to the person sitting next to you. And he said, he made us sit there for like a minute with our wallet being held by somebody else. And he said, that was the most uncomfortable minute I've ever spent in church. Can you imagine? And I said, so you were alone? This was a total stranger holding your wallet. I said, it wasn't like your wife or anything. He says, yeah, well, it wouldn't have been any better if it had been my wife. Money is private. We think this is the central problem. And if money isn't discussed, if it isn't discussed in the church, then how do you address money being mine? How do you address over-consuming? Those two especially. So the church needs to be a place, I think, that talks about money, that confronts these beliefs, but I think often by its silence. The church confirms in the minds of those in the pews that money is sacred, that this is an area of our lives over which Christ has no control, which I don't think is what we intend to communicate, but I think by silence we can kind of reinforce that. All right, what we want you to do right now, and we're going to switch off, Phil and I, but before we switch off, we want you to take at your tables some time and talk about these 4 things. Which of these 4, first of all, do you think is your issue, your biggest issue, as you relate to money? And then second, within your congregations. So think about it in both ways, but we don't want you to lose track of personally. Think about this personally. Which of these 4 is the area in which Christ would most challenge you, the temptation for you? Yes.